It's pretty hard to follow my distinguished colleague's speech and actually address some of the sort of bigger points, because fundamentally there wasn't that much to go on. But I will try my best, and I'll try my best by dealing with some of the things you raised, and also, unfortunately, desperately scrambling some of my notes here and actually bring stuff up which is not necessarily original. So what I plan to do is give you a very brief introduction. Then I'll give you a couple of examples of how we over here think that the UN is irrelevant, from examples which are clearly very important and are clear in everybody's minds. And then I think I'm going to go in a sort of a more macro level to explain to you all why we believe that the UN couldn't be irrelevant. No such thing as the United Nations. So by way of introduction, Americans, and I imagine most of you here most Americans believe that the UN is irrelevant. For most Americans, the UN is essentially some sort of nebulous concept run by some guys with unpronounceable names that are instantly forgettable. For most New Yorkers, let's face it, what do we know about the UN? What do we care about the UN? It's an ugly building on the east side of Manhattan with no air conditioning and responsible for $80 million in unpaid parking tickets. Now, if we look at what this UN is supposedly responsible for, let's look, the most obvious thing, right, is the whole Russia-Georgia conflict. Where has the UN been here? Okay, in what is perhaps one of the most outrageous land grabs and territorial violations of the sovereignty of a country in recent times, the UN has been totally silent. And why? Guess what? Russia's on the Security Council. Try to get a resolution through that one. What has the EU's response been? The EU's response has been, well, we had a meeting, we got together, we said that it's absolutely disgraceful what they did. Please don't do it again. You'll have your chance to say, please don't do it again. And then they scratched their heads and said, you know what we'll do? We'll try and restrict the visas, perhaps, for Russian officials, Russian business people coming into the EU. Didn't pass on that one. What did the US do? Now, I know a lot of you guys don't like Dick Cheney, got a little bad press and everything, but the US sent a US Navy warship into the port of Porty with humanitarian aid, plus a check for $1 billion. Now, I find it ironic that these guys over here talk about, you know, the aid given through the UN, and that the UN at least has an aid role. But even here we've seen the UN, first of all, can't deliver the aid. Two, they don't have any aid to deliver. The US came through. How about Darfur? Darfur is a situation where there's been a genocide for the last 6 years. Everybody knows it. Mia Farrow in the Wall Street Journal wrote very movingly a couple of weeks ago in an op-ed piece how she had been there, how on August 25th, recently, a refugee camp for Darfuris, the Sudanese government came around, slaughtered everybody. They didn't allow any humanitarian aid in there. Nothing happened.
In the cases of Rwanda or anything you've heard us, Yugoslavia or anything like that, we are not for a second saying the United Nations in its current form is perfect. We're saying it needs reform. The way for reform,
join us!
The way for reform is not by undermining the United Nations in the way that America has, it's by strengthening the United Nations.
Indeed, you hope to make it relevant.
Oh, that's
because it's not.
Wait, that's my job. So the proposition these guys over here are essentially, what they're trying to say is, it sounds like they admitted that the UN is irrelevant in its present form. It sounds like they've just made our case. And instead what they try to say is recharacterize the United Nations. We know the nations aren't united. We know it doesn't make any sense. We know Russia's on the Security Council. We know China's on the Security Council. Try and do something about Zimbabwe, Russia vetoes it. Try and do something about Darfur, China vetoes it. But you know, we could reform it. How the hell are you going to reform it? Are you going to create some sort of a majority vote on the Security Council, which would be an obvious attempt to circumvent each country's veto? Does anyone honestly think that's going to happen? And that actually leads me to the sort of second point, second structure of our argument here, and that is with regard to the UN concept, because as you just saw, they want to reform it. And my premise would be that you cannot reform the United Nations. Let's face it, 5 countries, all democracies, currently contribute 60% of the UN's budget. 60% of the UN's budget. Those 6 countries, the US, Japan, Germany, France and the UK, contribute 60%. Now, if we were to create some sort of league of democracies and somehow exclude all these rogue states, right, which is in and of itself very, very difficult, then perhaps that league of democracies could have some relevance. But as presently constituted, who are we kidding? I have complete faith in the moral, economic, and military might of the United States. Thank God it's a democracy. And when any country in the world finds itself in serious trouble, as Georgia has done most recently, they know most vividly that they cannot rely on the EU, they cannot rely on the UN, and the only people they can rely on is the United States.
On that point, that's depending on whether or not they have oil, of course.
Now, none of us here are some sort of we're all essentially realists. You know, the whole question of, you know, whether there's oil or not, there's interest. Sure, foreign policy, and that's a separate discussion, foreign policy is certainly governed by interests, okay? There has to be generally an interest. It is difficult to go around the world for any one nation to be the sort of nation builder around the world and fix the whole world's problems. We have to try and do what we can within the limited resources we have. Now, so, in conclusion.
Nothing if not adaptable.
Is the UN irrelevant? Damn right it is, we say. Thank you.